Imagine losing someone you love in an instant without having the chance to say goodbye. Noah and Alice, inseparable brothers, entered the mansion just looking for answers. What they didn't know is that that quest would lead them to face forces far beyond their understanding. Alice sacrificed everything to free the trapped souls, but now, Noah is alone. He was saved, but at what cost? And you? How far would you go to save the one you love? Was her sacrifice enough? Or does the mystery of the mansion still hold darker secrets? Get ready, because what you discover could haunt you forever. The sky was covered in dark clouds, and a light mist hung over the town of Westbrook as the new residents arrived. Westbrook was a typical American town, with quiet streets, old-fashioned shops, and a community that seemed frozen in time. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and any news was quickly discussed in the cafes and on the streets. When the Turner family decided to move to the city, they had no idea what was in store for them. The old mansion on the hill, an imposing and decaying structure, was the only property available that fit the family's tight budget. Emma Turner, a pragmatic and ever-optimistic woman, saw potential in the house, despite its state of disrepair. Her children, Noah, 17, and Alice, 13, were not so enthusiastic. The house exuded an oppressive energy, something they could not explain, but which they felt from the moment they walked through the rusty gate. "It's just an old house," Emma said with a smile. "Nothing a little work and love can't fix." The neighborhood didn't greet them with much fanfare, which seemed unusual for a small town. Most of the residents watched them from afar, keeping a distance that Noah found odd. In the few conversations they had, the neighbors seemed wary, looking away when the mansion was mentioned. No one told them about the place's dark reputation, as if some silent pact kept the story buried. Soon after moving in, Noah and Alice began to notice strange things. Noises at night, doors that closed by themselves, and the constant feeling of being watched. Alice, who was more sensitive to the energies around her, was the most affected. She would wake up in the middle of the night with vivid nightmares, always with the same image. A woman in a white dress, standing at the top of the stairs, staring at her with empty eyes. Noah, on the other hand, was more skeptical. He tried to convince himself and his sister that it was all just coincidence. Old houses creak, and people imagine things when they are in unfamiliar surroundings. But even he began to feel the weight of the house, as if something invisible was always lurking. The first weekend after moving in, Noah and Alice decided to explore the town. As they walked through the quiet streets, they noticed how the older residents discreetly avoided them. When they finally entered a small cafe for a coffee, they found a group of young people their own age. They seemed more welcoming, and soon they were engaged in lively conversation about life in Westbrook. It was then that one of the young men, Jack, mentioned the house on the hill. "Did you guys really move into that old mansion?" he asked, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. Noah nodded, trying to sound nonchalant. "Yeah, it's just a house. A little old, but nothing major." The other kids exchanged nervous glances. "You know what happened back there, right?" asked Sarah, one of the girls in the group. Noah and Alice looked at each other, now intrigued. "Nobody talks about it much," Jack continued, his voice lowering. "But the house on the hill has a dark history. In the 1960s, an entire family disappeared from there. No one has ever found out what happened. And before that, there were a series of unexplained tragedies with the previous owners." The silence at the table was palpable. Alice felt a chill run down her spine. "Disappeared?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "Yes," Sarah replied. "They just disappeared. The police never found anything, not even a body. It's like they evaporated." Noah tried to remain calm. "Do you think the house is cursed?" "We don't know for sure," Jack said, looking around to make sure no one else was listening. "But they say the people who live there start seeing things, hearing voices, and then disappear." Alice turned pale. The description of the strange happenings in the house began to resonate with her own experiences since they had moved in. Noah, on the other hand, refused to believe in curses, but he couldn't deny that something about the house wasn't right. The group ended the conversation with a warning. "Be careful around that house," Sarah said. "If you start to feel strange, get out of there." With this ominous warning echoing in their minds, Noah and Alice returned home, filled with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Little did they know that the house on the hill had already chosen its next targets. Back at the mansion, the atmosphere inside the house was tense. After hearing the stories of the young people in the cafeteria, both Noah and Alice began to look at the house with different eyes. Although Noah tried to maintain a rational attitude, doubt was already planted in his mind. Alice, on the other hand, felt an increasingly intense connection with the strange phenomena that occurred there. The noises at night seemed more frequent, and the shadows that could previously be explained by poor lighting now seemed to have a life of their own. That night, while Emma slept in the master bedroom, Noah and Alice lay awake in their respective rooms, restless. The clock in the living room was almost midnight when a loud noise echoed through the house. It was as if something had fallen or been knocked over with force. Noah jumped out of bed, his heart racing, and went to check what had happened. In the darkness of the hallway, he found Alice already standing, holding a flashlight and shaking hands. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice thick with fear. "I heard you." "Stay behind me," Noah replied, trying to sound braver than he felt. Together, they walked down the stairs, the steps creaking beneath their feet, until they reached the living room. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but something was off. It was then that Noah noticed. The large antique mirror that hung on the wall, inherited with the house, was slightly crooked, as if someone had pushed it. He approached it cautiously, the beam of the flashlight trembling in his hand. As he straightened the mirror, something cold and icy touched his skin. The sensation was so intense that it made him recoil sharply. "There's something wrong with this mirror," he murmured, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. Alice stepped closer, staring at their reflections. "I've felt this before," she said, her eyes wide. "Whenever I'm near this mirror, I feel like someone is watching me." Noah didn't know what to think, but he decided it was best not to touch the mirror any further for now. Suddenly, a cold wind blew through the room, making the curtains flutter even though the windows were all closed. "Let's go back upstairs," he suggested, discomfort growing in his chest. That night, the two barely slept, and the strange events continued. Emma, however, seemed oblivious to everything. To her, the house was just an old building that needed renovation and love. However, not even Emma's optimistic energy could protect the family from what was to come. Over the next few days, the manifestations in the house began to intensify. Alice reported hearing voices murmuring in her room at night. They were indistinct words, whispers that echoed off the walls, as if someone was trying to communicate. Noah, skeptical by nature, still tried to find logical explanations, but it became increasingly difficult to ignore what was happening. It was during a quiet afternoon that everything changed. Noah was in the backyard, trying to fix the old wooden fence that surrounded the property, when he saw something moving inside the house through the second-story window. At a glance, he was sure he saw a female figure, dressed in a long white dress, cross the hallway and disappear into one of the bedrooms. His heart stopped for a moment, and he ran inside the house. He took the stairs two at a time, his mind whirling. It couldn't be his mother, for she had gone out shopping, and Alice was at school. When he reached the hallway, he opened the door to the room where he had seen the figure enter. The room was empty, no sign that anyone had been there. The bed was perfectly made, the curtains were drawn, and the air was stale. Noah stood still for a moment, feeling the presence of something around him. He looked around the room, trying to ignore the shiver that ran down his spine. He knew something was there, but he didn't know what. That same night, Alice was struck by a nightmare even more vivid than the previous ones. She dreamed that she was alone in the house, and as she walked through the dark hallways, a woman's voice called to her. "Come to me. I need you." The voice was soft, but carried a deep melancholy. In the dream, Alice followed the voice to the attic. When she opened the door, she found the same woman in the white dress that Noah had seen. The woman had her back to her, looking out the window, but her presence filled the room in an oppressive way. When Alice woke up in a cold sweat, she felt as if the dream had been more than just a figment of her mind. She knew that the woman who haunted her nightmares was connected to the mansion and that something terrible had happened there. Determined to understand what was happening, Noah and Alice decided to research more about the mansion's history. With the help of Jack, the young man they had met at the cafe, they went to the town library in search of old records. After hours of research, they found an article dated 1963 that mentioned the tragedy that had occurred at the house. The Beaumont family, who lived in the mansion in the 1960s, had mysteriously disappeared. The article reported that the couple, Jonathan and Elizabeth Beaumont, along with their young daughter, Clara, were last seen at a social event in town. However, days later, no sign of them was found. The house was locked from the inside, and the furniture was covered in dust, as if no one had lived there for months. The most disturbing detail, however, was in the testimony of one of the investigators at the time. He mentioned that the only clue found in the house was a bloodstain near the mirror in the living room. Details about the investigation were scarce, and the case was filed as an unexplained disappearance. "That's why no one talks about this house," Jack said, leafing through the old papers. "The townspeople would rather forget, but it's clear that something very sinister happened there." Alice bent over the papers, looking at the old photographs of the Beaumont family. Young Clara, with her long blonde hair and innocent eyes, seemed to haunt her. "I think the woman of my dreams is her mother, Elizabeth," Alice whispered. "She's trapped here, somehow." "But why?" Noah asked. "And what happened to them?" The trio knew they were approaching something big, but with every step they took, they felt as if they were awakening ancient forces that would rather remain dormant. Back at the mansion, the air felt heavier than ever. Noah and Alice felt like they were on the verge of a revelation, but at the same time, something held them captive in that house, as if the structure itself was alive, watching their movements. It was a cold late afternoon when, as they searched more of the mansion, they found a locked door at the end of the second-floor hallway. It was the attic, a place they had never explored before. The key was not nearby, but Noah, determined to get in, found an old key in a drawer in the kitchen. The key fit perfectly into the rusty lock. When they opened the attic door, the smell of dust and old wood filled the air. Dim afternoon light filtered in through a small, dusty window, partially illuminating the room. The attic was filled with old objects, furniture covered in sheets and stacked boxes full of things that had belonged to the previous residents. But what caught Alice's attention was a small wooden chest, half hidden in the corner, as if someone had tried to hide it. She approached it slowly, feeling a strange familiarity as she touched the worn surface of the chest. "It must be Elizabeth's," Alice whispered, as Noah watched closely. With trembling hands, she opened the trunk, revealing its contents. Inside were old letters, a few black and white photographs, and a diary with pages yellowed with age. As they leafed through it, they realized that it was the diary of Elizabeth Beaumont, the former resident of the mansion who had mysteriously disappeared along with her family. Noah and Alice exchanged silent glances before beginning to read. The first few pages of the diary were simple records of everyday life. Elizabeth wrote about her life with Jonathan and little Clara, fondly describing the happy times in the mansion. But as the pages progressed, the tone of the diary changed drastically. Elizabeth began to describe strange events that occurred in the house. Voices that whispered in the night, doors that opened and closed by themselves, and the constant feeling that they were being watched. "Jonathan thinks I'm going crazy," Elizabeth wrote in one passage. "But I know there's something here. Something ancient, something evil. I feel it every day, like an invisible presence watching us." The last few pages were the most disturbing. Elizabeth described a female figure that began to appear in her dreams, always dressed in white, always silent, but with eyes that conveyed immense sadness. Elizabeth believed that the figure wanted to communicate something, but she didn't know what. "She watches me from the mirror," Elizabeth wrote, her handwriting trembling in the last few entries. "Always from the mirror." The diary ended abruptly, without explanation, but enough for Noah and Alice to understand that Elizabeth had been the victim of the same curse that now seemed to be hanging over them. Alice closed the diary, her hands sweating. She knew. Elizabeth knew something was wrong, and no one believed her. "But that doesn't explain what happened to them," Noah said, standing up. "If they all disappeared, what caused it?" Alice looked at the mirror in the attic, The same sort of mirror as the one in the drawing room. I think it's something to do with mirrors, she said, almost in a whisper. Convinced that the mirrors in the house were somehow connected to the strange phenomena, Noah and Alice returned to the living room, where the large mirror still hung on the wall. The late afternoon light illuminated the room softly, but the mirror seemed to emit a light of its own, a barely perceptible vibration. What do we do now? Noah asked, unsure of how to handle the situation. Alice, however, seemed more determined. She held the amulet she had inherited from her grandmother, feeling the comforting warmth that always accompanied her. We need to try to communicate with her, Alice said, referring to the figure Elizabeth had mentioned in the diary. Noah looked at his sister suspiciously. Do you want to talk to whatever it is? We have no choice, Alice replied. If we do nothing, we'll end up like them. With little choice, Noah agreed. They stood in front of the mirror, the silence around them almost deafening. Alice held the amulet tightly, while Noah stared intently at the reflection. For a few minutes, nothing happened. But then, slowly, a figure began to form in the glass. It was a woman, dressed in white, just like in Alice's dream. Her eyes were filled with sadness, and she watched them with an intensity that made both their hearts race. Who are you? Alice asked, her voice firm despite her fear. The figure did not answer with words, but the image in the mirror began to change. They were no longer seeing just the living room. The mirror showed scenes from the past. They saw Elizabeth Beaumont, sitting in front of the same mirror, looking at the white figure with the same frightened eyes. They saw Jonathan Beaumont trying to protect his daughter as strange shadows moved through the house. And then, suddenly, the mirror showed the moment when the family had disappeared. They were pulled, one by one, into the mirror, their expressions frozen in pure terror. Alice covered her mouth with her hand, struggling not to scream. They were taken by the mirror, she whispered. Noah took a step back, trying to process what he had just seen. Does that mean they're trapped in there? Yes, said Alice. And if we don't find some way to free them, we shall end up the same way. Determined to save the Beaumonts and avoid the same fate, Noah and Alice decided they needed to make direct contact with the entity in the mirror. However, they knew it would be dangerous. Alice's amulet would be their only protection against whatever was on the other side. That night, when the clock struck midnight, the two of them stood before the mirror again. The air was chilly, and the house seemed quieter than ever. Alice held the amulet in one hand and Noah's hand in the other. Together, they closed their eyes and asked to be taken to the place where the Beaumonts were being held. Suddenly, the floor seemed to disappear beneath their feet. When they opened their eyes, they were no longer in the living room. They were in a dark, hazy place, where the walls seemed to be made of shadows and the floor was an endless expanse of cracked mirrors. In the center of that place, the Beaumonts stood like statues, their faces pale and empty. We need to free them, Alice said, her voice sounding stronger than she felt inside. But before they could move, the white figure appeared again. This time, its expression was one of anger, its eyes glowing brightly. You shouldn't be here, the figure said, its voice reverberating like an echo. This is my domain, and all who enter here belong to me. The place where Noah and Alice were standing seemed to be suffocating with the presence of the white figure. The shadows around them moved, as if the darkness had a will of its own. Alice clutched the amulet tighter, feeling that it was her only anchor in this distorted reality. The entity approached slowly, each step echoing like thunder in the mirrors around it. You can't keep us here, Alice said, her voice shaking but full of conviction. We don't belong here. The entity tilted its head, its eyes shining with cold anger. You don't understand. This is not just my domain. This is the reflection of your own choices, your own fears. Those who look into the mirror and do not face the truth end up here, trapped forever. Noah looked at the Beaumonts, frozen in the depths of that dark space, and something inside him stirred. What do you mean? What are you trying to tell us? He asked, desperate for answers. The entity did not respond immediately, but the mirrors around them began to change. The cracks in their surfaces reflected distorted images of Noah and Alice, as if they were confronted by their own insecurities and failures. In one mirror, Noah saw an image of himself failing to protect his sister and himself. In another, Alice saw her fears of loneliness and of not being able to help those she loved. This place, it reveals what is hidden, Alice whispered, understanding suddenly dawning. We are fighting our own demons. Alice felt a deep weight on her chest as she realized that the entity was showing them their greatest fears. To escape this nightmare, they would have to face them, not run from them. She turned to Noah, who was still staring at the reflections with a mixture of terror and confusion. It's not about escaping, Alice said, her voice firmer now. It's about facing what's inside us. Noah looked at his sister, seeing determination grow in her eyes. He knew she was right. This place was a manifestation of everything they feared, and the entity was only fueling those fears. To defeat it, they would need to win their own internal battles. Then let's get this over with, Noah said, taking a step toward the entity. We are not prisoners here. We will not be controlled by fear. The entity, which until then seemed invincible, hesitated for a brief moment, as if Noah and Alice's words had shaken its power. The shadows around it began to stir, and the mirrors reflecting its insecurities began to crack even more. The entity, enraged at the loss of control, advanced quickly toward Noah and Alice. The amulet Alice was holding began to glow with an intense, almost blinding light, as if reacting to the negative energy that dominated the place. The light seemed to drive away the darkness, forcing the entity to retreat for a brief moment. Now, cried Alice, we must use the amulet. With her remaining strength, Alice raised the amulet towards the entity. The light emanating from it intensified, striking the entity directly. A deafening scream echoed through the space as the white figure writhed in pain and rage. The mirrors around it began to shatter, one by one, as the entity lost its power. But then something unexpected happened. The amulet began to vibrate wildly in Alice's hands, as if it were consuming all the energy around it, including her own. She felt a strong tug on her soul, as if the amulet was demanding more than she could give. Alice let go. Noah shouted, sensing the danger. But it was too late. The amulet exploded in a wave of light, consuming Alice completely. Noah was thrown back by the impact, and when the light finally dissipated, the entity was gone, and so was Alice. Noah slowly stood up, his head spinning with what had just happened. He looked around, but Alice was no longer there. The dark, distorted place they were in was beginning to crumble, as if reality itself was falling apart. He ran over to where his sister was, but all that was left was the amulet, now cold and lifeless. No, Alice, Noah whispered, the pain in his voice echoing through the emptiness around him. It was then that he heard a voice, not the entity's voice, but his sister's. I'm here, Noah, the voice whispered, coming from somewhere far away. He looked around, but couldn't see it. You saved everyone, the voice continued, but I had to stay. I made the choice. Noah realized with horror that his sister had sacrificed herself to destroy the entity. She had done what was necessary to free the Beaumonts and all the other souls trapped in that place. But in exchange, she would remain trapped there forever. No, it can't be, Noah said, tears streaming down his face. You can't stay here. It's okay, Noah, Alice's voice said, softer now. You're going to be okay. And I'll find a way to get back. I promise. Before Noah could respond, the place around him began to fade. The shadows faded, and he was pulled back into the mansion's living room. The clock on the wall read midnight, and everything was quiet. The nightmare was over, but Alice was no longer by his side. If you were stuck in this story as much as Noah was in the mansion, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more mysteries and stories that make you think. Did Alice's sacrifice touch you? What would you do in her place? Leave your opinion in the comments. And remember, we never know where a mystery can lead. Until next time,